Hello and welcome or welcome back. This month I'm going to be talking about adaptations, specifically movies and TV series adapted from books. Even though it's very common for books to be adapted in these formats, it's actually very hard to do well. And that's why you often hear people say, the book was better, or complain about what was in the book that wasn't in the movie. The differences between the written and audiovisual formats, as well as audience expectations for works in these categories, can often lead to the movie or the TV series looking very different from the book. Now, I do have to say that as much as I tend to enjoy books, and I usually come down on the side of the book was better when they change something significant, the fact that there are changes isn't necessarily a bad thing and doesn't necessarily make it a bad movie. I have a couple of criteria that I look at when I look at whether an adaptation was done well or badly, and whether it's totally faithful to the source material isn't one of them, because they never are, or very, very rarely, and I have yet to find an example of it. What I tend to look at is, do the changes improve the story? As in, do they make it work better in the new format? Do they expand a little bit on something that happened off screen? Things like that I tend to feel very positively about. Or do they detract from it in some way? Things that change the characters' personalities or the overall themes and messages of the story. Things that make the story inconsistent or make it make a little bit less sense. Things that were removed that you really need in order to fully understand what's going on. Stuff like that I tend to react very negatively to. And then there are things that are just kind of neutral, like, why did you change this? I don't know. Does it make it better? Does it make it worse? It doesn't really make a difference. And then additionally, I look at whether it can stand on its own, as in, do you have to read the book in order to make sense of the movie, or does the movie make sense if you're just watching it as a movie? And then, even if it's not true to the exact sequence of events in the book, is it generally true to the spirit of the book? Does it follow the same themes? Are the characters more or less the same people? Do you get a similar experience out of watching the movie that you do out of reading the book, or is it very different? All of that is important for this discussion because in this video I'm going to be talking about the different adaptations of Jane Austen's Persuasion. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at the BBC adaptation from 1995, the BBC adaptation from 2007, and the Netflix adaptation from 2022. Now, I already made a video reviewing the 2022 one when it first came out, and I'll put a little link to that up here. If you haven't watched it yet, feel free to check it out. To summarize, what on earth were they doing? And this was just a completely different story from the original. That's basically what my thoughts come down to. Like, why adapt Persuasion if you're not going to do Persuasion? But as I was preparing for this month's video theme, I was thinking about it and it occurred to me the sequence of events is basically the same in that movie as in the others. They all follow the same basic outline, and if you were to just put it in bullet points without any of the characterization or the mood or theme or style or any of that, just the events, they're very, very similar in that version to in the versions from 2007 or 1995, which in turn are very similar to the events in the novel. None of them really break away in terms of going in a weird direction with the plot, and I say that because some movie adaptations do that. For instance, in another video this month, I'm going to be talking about Jurassic Park and its sequels as adaptations of the two Jurassic Park novels. And spoiler alert, the second movie is technically based on the second book, The Lost World, but it's completely different. It's an entirely different story. It has an entirely different plot and an entirely different ending. So when I say that the recent Netflix adaptation of Persuasion sticks pretty close to the original plot, that's what I mean. I mean that it doesn't veer off in a completely different direction and all of a sudden there's a T-Rex running around a city and that was nowhere in the book. So this is a good opportunity, I think, to talk about the way in which, even if the basic plot is the same, the themes and characterization and other factors in terms of how the story is presented can make a huge difference in how an adaptation comes out and how it relates to the original. In the original novel, Anne Elliot has a very gentle and introverted personality. The fact that she's easily influenced and persuaded leads to the main conflict of the story, which is that she was in love with this guy, but she turned him down because her father and her godmother, Lady Russell, encouraged her to do so. And now he's back, and she still has feelings for him, and vice versa, but it's an incredibly awkward situation because she broke his heart. She broke his heart not because she wanted to, but because other people thought that she should. So her lack of willingness to take a stand for what she wants is actually pretty essential to her characterization. It's a flaw, definitely, but it's not the sort of flaw that can be easily erased to make her more likable, not without making the story incredibly difficult to believe. On the other hand, her willingness to put others first and to think of others rather than herself is contrasted with her sisters, who are just completely full of themselves and completely selfish. So it's not entirely a flaw, it's a good trait that has been taken to an unhealthy extreme and has had a negative impact on her life because of that. I think that in the versions from 1995 and 2007, it's really obvious that that's the sort of person Anne is. It comes across very clearly, especially in the 1995 version. Her characterization, the way that she's acted, the way that she is written, it's very consistent with who she was in the book. However, in the version from 2022, she has this sarcastic and obstinate and kind of obnoxious personality throughout. And because of that, it seems really hard to believe that she would have ever been persuaded out of something that she really wanted. And it takes away from the way that she grows over the course of the story to have her be like just so not even caring what people think all the way through. The parts of the story later on where she takes a stand and begins to make her own choices, the moment where she takes control of the situation after Louisa Musgrave is injured, the moment where she insists on keeping her plans to visit Mrs. Smith rather than going with the rest of her family to see Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret, and of course, her getting back together with Frederick at the end. All of those are undermined, if they're present at all in the story, because the part with Mrs. Smith was not, if she had that kind of personality all along. It's not just that it makes her come across in a very different way, it's that it kind of negates her character growth. Another thing that's different between the three different adaptations is the ways in which they deal with the fact that in a book you've got a narrator, and the narrator tells you things that are going on inside the characters' heads or otherwise wouldn't show up on screen. The version from 1995 doesn't really address that. It deals with mostly facial expressions and dialogue and visual cues and other ways of using traditional movie methods to convey information. Sometimes that does mean that quotes that are kind of memorable from the book get lost, and the meaning of those isn't ever really conveyed. Like, for instance, the part about we're not even strangers because we can never become acquainted. I think you get that feeling from that part of the movie, but it's not really said in the way that it is in the book. The version from 2007 deals with this by having Anne occasionally write in a diary. And there's a voiceover for what she's writing, so the parts of the narration that deal with her inner thoughts can be conveyed to the viewer. The version from 2022 famously uses the look directly at the camera and just talk kind of method, which ultimately leads to the personality of the narrator being imposed on Anne. Now, there's a problem with that. Jane Austen had a very specific narration style that's different from the personalities of any of her protagonists. It's also, I feel like, a little bit more disruptive of the flow of the story than just the diary voiceovers, in that those are usually played over moments that are kind of an interlude between scenes or whatever, whereas in the version from 2022, she just stops in the middle of things and looks at the camera and starts talking. One of the biggest changes, though, is the overall mood of the story. The versions from 1995 and 2007 both have that bittersweet, melancholy, barely hoping for a second chance kind of feeling to them. They're not lighthearted or humorous stories, and they're not portrayed as such. They have their moments of humor and happiness, and of course they have a happy ending, but for the most part they're not lighthearted stories. Whereas the version from 2022 completely rebranded the whole thing as a lighthearted romantic comedy. So even though it has the same basic plot, things are played in a humorous way that were taken very seriously in the original, or things are added to make it more humorous and lighthearted. Like, for instance, the scene where Anne first encounters Frederick again. In the other adaptations, she's just, she's having breakfast in the kitchen and he walks in. Whereas in the 2022 version, she's doing all this humorous stuff to entertain her nephew, and she's, like, making a fool of herself, and then he walks in. And so it adds humor to a situation where there really wasn't any originally. In terms of just sticking to the plot, I would actually say that the version from 2007 probably strays a little bit farther from it than the version from 2022. Changing the context in which Frederick wrote the note and having Anne run around through the streets of Bath looking for him and just barely missing him several times, that gives the whole thing a very different ending than what happened in the original. However, on an emotional note, it hits much closer to the emotions provoked by the original. It's bittersweet, it's nostalgic, a happy ending coming out of a dismal and unpleasant situation. So those are my thoughts on those three versions of Persuasion and how they compare to the original in terms of theme, characterization, mood, and other things besides just the bare bones of the plot. I would say that the 1995 version with Amanda Root as Anne is definitely the closest in terms of keeping everything as faithful as possible to the book. The version from 2007 with Sally Hawkins as Anne is emotionally very close to the book. It provokes the right feelings, it follows the right themes, the characterization is on target, but a little bit of the plot is changed around, streamlined, or exaggerated. And then the Netflix adaptation from 2022 is, even though it's not that different from the others in terms of the basic plot, just very different in terms of the characterization, the mood, the theme, the style. Everything about it is changed other than the plot. So I feel like these three movies are very representative of an adaptation that's extremely faithful to the book, although not exact, an adaptation that's true to the spirit of the book, at least for the most part, and an adaptation that just completely goes in a different direction than the book, although keeping the same basic plot for the most part. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. I'll be making more videos throughout the month on adaptations of books, so if you want to see more of those, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.